Welcome everybody. I'm delighted that you've come to this session after Gaza, the return of anti-Semitism. I'm Claire Fox and I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas. And I was very keen to have this session because I have been concerned, a number of us have been concerned about whether there is a shift in atmosphere around the issue of anti-Semitism in this country in recent times particularly. But just to tell you one anecdote, just to illustrate my concern, I'm traditionally from anti-Zionist, critical of Israel position. That's where I come from historically, politically. I was speaking in Liverpool recently, and I was standing outside, as is my wont, having a cigarette with some students, and there was a Gaza demonstration going on, very lively, very loud, very animated, and I've been on lots of demonstrations, and I was interested to see, and they all stopped outside a building, and they were all chanting very animatedly, and then they suddenly invaded the building. And I had no idea what the building was, so I went around the corner and I discovered that the building was Marks and Spencer's. And I said to the people that I was having a cigarette with, oh my God, they've just invaded Marks and Spencer's. And they said, yes, well, you know, they are implicated. There was something very uncomfortable about that, and these were quite, you know, smart people, and I couldn't understand why they didn't think that possibly this was a dangerous and not the same as having a political position in relation to what Israel was doing in Gaza, but the identification of a shop because it was owned by particular people. And there's been a whole range of incidents noted in the blurb for this session, whether it was the cultural boycotts of Israeli theatre groups up at the radical Edinburgh Fringe, the furore around the Tricycle Theatre, which has subsequently been overturned, but where that Jewish film festival was stopped because of Israeli funding and so on. That have made me have some qualms, which is what we wanted to discuss. So really what I'm interested in is seeing whether there is a new strain of anti-Semitism on the rise, whether there's the boundary between fair criticism of Israel and a kind of hatred of Israel is really what are getting muddled up. I noted that the chief rabbi wrote in the Telegraph, I am wary of alarmism. While we are understandably concerned about anti-Semitism now, it would be an exaggeration to draw comparisons with the past. Having said that, we need to acknowledge that the problem of anti-Semitism is today pronounced and causing deep anxieties amongst Jewish people across Britain and worldwide. That point, though, about alarmism is worth taking note. I don't want this to necessarily seem, by organising this session, which we organised quite late on when we were programming, to be accused of scaremongering. And even Howard Jacobson, whose latest novel, Jay, is really about anti-Semitism, potentially. Even Howard Jacobson makes the point, if you actually talk about anti-Semitism in this country, it sounds like paranoia. We've never been safer. So there's a balancing act here. This is also not a rehearsal of what do we all think of Israel and the recent war in Gaza. That's not what it's about. I'm not banning you from mentioning it. It's just that it's a distraction and it's not entirely where we want to centre. So let me introduce the panel in the order in which they'll speak. First of all, we're going to hear from Leslie Claff, who is Senior Lecturer in Law at Sheffield Hallam University. He's taught law in the past in the US for 7 years before taking up a post at Sheffield. She's also affiliate professor of law at Haifa University, or was between 2007 and 12. She's the associate editor of the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism, serves on the advisory board of the Berlin International Centre for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and is a member of the UK Lawyers for Israel, and appeared in a film documentary in 2003 in relation to campus anti-Semitism, and has done some very interesting research and writing on the particular issue of anti-Semitism on campus. Can we give Leslie a warm welcome, please? Next, we'll hear from Professor Frank Furedi, who's a sociologist, internationally acclaimed public intellectual, an associate now at the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent, Canterbury, where he was professor for many years. the author of a series of agenda-setting books, from Wasted on Education to The Politics of Fear, on Tolerance, Authority, A Sociological History. A bit of a media don, endlessly on the telly and on the radio, international speaker, speaks all over the world, and has written a series of articles over recent years on some troubling aspects of what he thinks is some kind of a return of cultural anti-Semitism. He's a Battle of Ideas regular, but we're delighted to have him on this particular panel. Can we give him a warm welcome? David Mellor, PC, QC, now a broadcaster on Classic FM and LBC, where his show with Ken Livingstone has been nominated for Best Speech Programme Awards by Sony, and is also a classical music critic for the Mail on Sunday. In the past, he's better known as the Conservative government, or as a Conservative government minister for 11 years, at the Home Office, the Foreign Office, the Treasury, as Department of State, and 2 cabinet posts as Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Secretary of State at the Department of National Heritage, which is now the DCMS. He's always interesting, always provocative. A number of people I met on the way in said they're coming to hear him, which is not to insult the rest of the speakers, but just to show the fans are in. I've actually no idea what he's going to say, but I'm interested because I know that it'll be something worth hearing. So can we give him a warm welcome? Thank you. Last but by no means least, Hugo Rifkin, who's a leader writer for The Times, where he also writes columns, features, reviews and satire. He's written a couple of columns on anti-Semitism, or on looking at this issue, which were particularly influential in making me think that this was something we ought to discuss. He's a regular guest on BBC Radio 4's The News Quiz. His first novel was published in 2006, Overexposure. He has a collection of satirical columns out called My Week, The Secret Diaries of Almost Everybody. He's one of the people I most enjoy reading in The Times. He's both funny but insightful, always a good combination. Can we give him a warm welcome, please? Leslie, can you kick us off, please?
The title of this debate is After Gaza, the Return of Anti-Semitism, ? And I interpreted that to raise the issue of the relationship between hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism, particularly in the aftermath of this summer's Gaza conflict. While not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, neither is all criticism of Israel free from anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism often manifests itself in discourses and movements that are opposed to Israel and Zionism, including those that claim to be anti-racist and opposed to anti-Semitism, such as those on the anti-Zionist left. This should not be surprising. There is a lot of anger towards Israel. There is a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. There's a long history of anti-Semitism in left-wing and radical politics. It would be most unexpected if the anger felt by the European left did not sometimes manifest itself in discourses and actions that are polluted by anti-Semitic tropes, memes, and themes. Much of this anti-Semitism is unconscious and unintentional. Anti-Semitism is a social fact and is not reducible to the intent or self-consciousness of the actors involved. It is produced through shared meanings and exclusions rather than as the result of individual moral failing. In deciding what criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic and what criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, we need to focus on anti-Semitic outcomes rather than on the inner essence of the person. So how do we identify anti-Semitic outcomes? It is difficult in the absence of an agreed definition of anti-Semitism. The European Union Monitoring Centre on Racism and Xenophobia's working definition in 2005, which provides guidelines for deciding when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Semitism, is controversial and has not been adopted in the United Kingdom, despite the recommendations of the report of the All-Party Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry into Anti-Semitism in 2006 and the recommendation of the London Conference on Combating Anti-Semitism in 2009. It's difficult to identify anti-Semitic outcomes because there is no single anti-Semitism, but rather many anti-Semitisms relating to specific times and places, all of which remain in the collective cultural reservoir. Identifying contemporary anti-Semitism requires understanding, judgment, and interpretation. Unconscious anti-Semitism can be identified by the replication of traditional anti-Semitic tropes, such as conspiracy theory and blood libel, and contemporary anti-Semitic tropes, such as Zionism is racism, Israel is an apartheid state, and Israelis are Nazis, in ostensibly anti-racist discourse. These contemporary tropes were launched at the UN Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, when Israel was accused of the 5 cardinal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. Actually, the Israel or Nazi trope, or Zionist Nazi trope, has its provenance in the British Foreign Office in 1945, when Britain sought to prevent survivors of Hitler's Europe from entering Palestine, or at least to restrict the numbers. Unconscious anti-Semitism can also be identified in the disproportionate attention given to criticizing Israel. A common feature of diverse anti-Semitisms is that they construct Jews as centrally important to everything that is wrong with the world. Jews are deemed to have a universal importance for mankind. Anti-Zionists similarly construct Israel or Zionism to be globally important. While one regrets the terrible loss of life among the Palestinian population, one might claim that the hostility shown to Israel this summer was so disproportionate that it was likely to have been tainted by anti-Semitism. Certainly, much of the anti-Israel hostility this summer involved the provocative comparison between the brutal and genocidal Nazi treatment of the Jews and the practices of the Israeli state towards the Palestinians, and the associated claim that the Holocaust was a moral lesson taught to, but not learnt by, the Jews. This Israel, Jews, Zionist, Nazi trope, also known as Holocaust inversion, is anti-Semitic because, according to Deborah Lipstadt, it amounts to soft-core denial of the Holocaust. It trivializes and relativizes the Shoah, whitewashes the crimes of the Nazis, and inflates the crimes of the Israelis. It is anti-Semitic because it comprises 3 distinct affirmations against Jews: that the Zionists and the Nazis share the same fascist ideology, that the Zionists were complicit in the Holocaust, and that the Zionists are to the Palestinians what the Nazis were to the Jews. There can accordingly be no compromise with Zionism or Israel because it is the expression of the principle of evil. It is anti-Semitic because the 2009 report of the European Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, called Understanding the Nazi Card, Intervening Against Anti-Semitic Discourse, reported that equating Israel with the Nazis has the potential to incite violence against British Jews. The high-profile German court ruling in 2009 referred to on this debate's website was a case of Holocaust inversion. It was not merely legitimate criticism of Israeli policy, as stated. Because contemporary anti-Semitism is frequently unconscious, there is a tendency for those replicating anti-Semitic tropes to deny their anti-Semitism. They frame their anti-Semitism as legitimate criticism of Israel. They accuse those raising concerns about contemporary anti-Semitism of acting in bad faith to stifle criticism of Israel. They claim that they are the victims of an ad hominem attack and assert that they are not anti-Semites. Well, they may well not be anti-Semites, but their denial of anti-Semitism is not helpful. It moves the debate from concerns about contemporary anti-Semitism to concerns about people lying for Israel. This could itself be interpreted as anti-Semitic, in effect, if not in intent, because it sees a secret agenda behind the charge of anti-Semitism, which is to silence Israel's critics, as a secret ploy designed by Zionists to let Israel get away with murder. The presumption behind this is that Israel cannot be defended openly, and so its defenders have to resort to underhand tactics. The denial of contemporary anti-Semitism prevents its identification and the marshalling of active resistance to it, which is something that people committed to anti-racism should wholeheartedly desire.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leslie. Very clear exposition there of your thoughts on the question. Frank?
I'm not sure about the concept of unconscious anti-Semitism, and at any rate, at the moment, I'm much more concerned with its conscious, explicit, tangible manifestation. You know, we live in a world where in the Ukraine, both sides brag about the fact that, you know, they're more against the Jews than the other side, and they point the finger at each other and say they're backed by the Jews. You have a situation where the country that I grew up in Hungary, we have a party that's explicitly Nazi and fascistic, and it's got 16% of the vote. And when I go to Holland or Belgium and I talk to people, you hear not unconscious anti-Semitism, but very conscious anti-Semitism, talking about the Jews this and the Jews that, quite clearly. At my university, we had situations where a lot of lecturers didn't know how to handle discussion in the seminar, when people would say, this is a university, higher education, that the Jews run the media and they control it, you know, and felt, you know, how do I handle this? You know, what do I say in circumstances like that? So there are, as far as I'm concerned, a very interesting development that has occurred. And I think it's important to realize that anti-Semitism never returns. It's not like there's an anti-Semitism in the past and it's now returning. Anti-Semitism has throughout history mutated into different forms, has been driven by different passions. And in many respects, what we have today is really historically specific to the circumstances of our time. And I think it would be wrong for us to simply work backwards and reimagine what happened in the past as really the kind of the inevitable embryonic form of what we're experiencing today. I'm kind of struggling with the question because I am quite surprised myself. I never expected anti-Semitism to crystallize into its contemporary form so fast. I mean, I was always aware of the fact that the moral rehabilitation of Jews after the Second World War was obviously, you know, sort of an uncertain and fragile effect. You have to remember that the main accomplishment of the Nazi experience was to make it very difficult for people to be openly anti-Semitic. It also, for the first time, created a more sacralized image of what Jews are like. For a while, to be Jewish, I remember going to New York, and to be Jewish was really cool, you know, sort of, and it was a really, you know, sort of good way that you could make an impact on people. And there was a sense in which, you know, Judaism had all these kind of positive connotations to it as a result of its moral rehabilitation. But there's always, I think, a fairly, you know, specific kind of experience. And what I'm really interested in as a sociologist in explaining are two things. First of all, what happened to, you know, why did this moral rehabilitation of Jews become unstuck and unravel, where today it's no longer, you know, sort of has that same force? I mean, how did that come about? And secondly, very interestingly, when I was a teenager, when I was a young man, you could literally talk about Zionism and Israel without talking about anti-Semitism or without even talking about Jews. The two questions were totally separate. And I remember very, very clearly you could have huge debates about Israel and the question of Jews and anti-Semitism, Holocaust, none of these things ever really entered into it. Whereas today, the two are integrally linked. Regardless of where you stand, regardless of your own personal opinion, you might think that's a wrong thing, but in the public imagination, globally and within Europe, the issue of Israel and the role of the Jews internationally are pretty much integrally linked together, and that's something that needs to be explained, how that has occurred. And it seems to me there's been 3 or 4 very important developments that have converged to create a situation where it's become much more acceptable to regard, in a sense, to regard Jews in a more pathologized form than would have been the case in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and throughout most of the 80s. One of those trends is the responsibility of Israel. I think that one of the things that Zionism has done in its, not its early phase, but its later phase, was to recast Zionist identity around the Holocaust. I think originally Zionism had a much more future-oriented, much more pioneering, much more, a very different kind of dynamic to it, where the Jews were meant to, if anything, they were meant to take control of their lives, they were meant to transform the world, they were meant to be just kind of normal beings like anybody else was. That was the essential message of it. At a certain point, Zionist cultural identity became very much intertwined with the Holocaust, and all of a sudden, the Holocaust became one of the main arguments as to why you need a state of Israel. The Holocaust becomes almost like something that you very closely identify with. And I think that was a mistake from Israel's point of view, because it basically meant that as a result of that, anybody who was hostile to Israel, hostile to Zionism, would by definition have to take up the Holocaust, would have to relate to the Holocaust in a way that contested, first of all, Israel's links to the Holocaust, and secondly would have to contest and increasingly would begin to contest the reality of the Holocaust, which is why, in a sense, that at least partially, there are other influences why the Holocaust became such a contested and increasingly contested phenomenon, why a lot of people are claiming their Holocaust, why a lot of people are criticizing Jewish people for saying, what's special about your Holocaust? And I think that gradually the trivialization of this horrific experience has created a situation where both the denial of the Holocaust, or at least saying that it was exaggerated, or at least casting doubt on it, is now on the agenda. And in many parts of Europe, people self-consciously call into question the Holocaust. I've been to a meeting recently in Hungary where people are laughing, when more Jews are coming back after 45 than left. All those things are now on the table and are, at least in popular culture, becoming increasingly accepted. Secondly, I think that one of the things that has occurred, and this is quite an important development, Israel's role as a result of the end of the Cold War has changed fundamentally. And Israel has begun to be seen as a liability by many of its Western allies. Israel is seen as no longer this reliable partner in the Cold War kind of circumstances. Israel is increasingly seen as an embarrassment, even by a lot of American policymakers. If you go to Washington, talk to young Democrats, you'll find that they do regard Israel as a drag, and they almost kind of wish that it just didn't exist because it makes American foreign policy so much more difficult to conduct. So as Israel is marginalized in terms of their worldview, then the role of Jews globally is also perceived in that kind of different kind of a way. And I think once Israel's role and identity became put to question, then a lot of the restraints that existed on the open expression of anti-Semitism were removed. And the third factor that allowed for these restraints for the open expression of anti-Semitism to be removed has been the growing population of young Muslim jihadist communities throughout Europe, or just young Muslim communities for whom the Holocaust never meant anything. They never felt any kind of guilt that some Europeans might have felt. As far as they were concerned, this wasn't our business, it wasn't really, sort of anything to do with us. And I think that in their own minds, Jews and Zionists were pretty much, the same problem. And as that became more and more prominent those expressions became more prominent in Europe, so increasingly youth culture, or at least parts of youth culture in Europe, but also a popular culture, European popular culture, felt empowered to raise these questions about the role of the Jews, and felt liberated to kind of bring to the surface many of the sentiments that it felt. So I think it's these three factors that converged to create an anti-Semitism that's very different than we ever experienced in the past, and whose trajectory is still an open question. But certainly in the eastern part of Europe, it is a very dangerous, destructive phenomenon. In places like France, Belgium, and Holland, Jews are entitled not to feel very safe. I think in England we still have a relatively secure kind of position, but it is something that is always, sort of put to the test.
Okay, thank you very much. David, your thoughts.
Well, hi everybody. In the immortal words of George W. Bush, sure is good to see such a dense crowd here today. And It's conventional to say how glad I am to be here. That's only partly true, actually. As I've listened to this, I've thought to myself, I'm a bit of a fish out of water here. I might have been better off in an even denser crowd at Selhurst Park watching Chelsea play Crystal Palace, and that remains a thought that will probably even grow in my mind. Though I think of myself as quite intelligent and reasonably well educated, my life has lain in the world of practicality. I've never been an academic. I'd be incapable of writing an essay to read out to you. But what I am able to tell you is that during the course of my life, I've held responsibilities for various things that have had a bearing on this. I was the Foreign Office Minister responsible for the Middle East at a difficult time. And I was a Home Office Minister for 5 years, taking through Parliament legislation to deal with things like racial prejudice, which we in this country have always turned our face against. And it still shocks me, actually, just to stay with football for a moment, to go to Eastern Europe and find regular booing of black players and the extent of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. It's extraordinary to me. We obviously have not only laws against such things, but we also, I think, there's a general public feeling against naked prejudice against people because of their religion or race. Is anti-Semitism on the increase? I think it probably is. What are the causes of that? Well, I think they're probably quite complicated. One of the causes of that, of course, is the growth of fundamentalist Islamic sentiment in this country and elsewhere, and that is proving to be extremely difficult to deal with. And I don't envy those whose responsibility it is to try and deal with it. I think it's impossible not to regard the situation in Gaza as unhelpful when it comes to combating anti-Semitism. How many of you have ever been to Gaza, actually? Yes, I suppose it's like the Archbishop of Canterbury, who talks a lot about heaven but has never been there. And I mean, I did go to Gaza in 1988. And having had conventionally pro-Israeli views when I went to Gaza, I was deeply shocked, actually, by the conditions there, the impossible conditions there, and what seemed to me to be the excessive authoritarianism of the occupying force. In fact, I spoke out against it, and it was an interesting experience for me to be driven out of Gaza a couple of hours after this incident to already be leading the World Service News and even making the front page of the New York Times. What that experience taught me is that anti-Semitism is a game played by both sides, actually. On the one hand, those who are anti-Semitic attach themselves to what's happening in the occupied territories and the seeming incapability of resolving those issues as a godsend, because it to them offers some kind of validation of their opinions. But may I tell you, it's not easy to be a critic of Israel in a very public way without yourself being accused of anti-Semitism. Now, I have quite a good defense to that. So many of my best friends are Jewish. I was in a Jewish chambers when I was at the bar, and I retain lots and lots of Jewish friends and retain most of them through my period of appearing to be the voice of Arab extremism, though I never was that either. But the reality is, allegations against people who have perfectly legitimate objections to the way Israel behaves, that they are anti-Semitic, is a dangerous game. There are members of the Jewish community that play, and I said so in 1988, and I say so again now. They shouldn't play that game because it is a dangerous game. Now, I personally think, well, what can I tell you except I've been in Israel twice in the last 12 months. I'm going to Israel again in November. I have lots of friends in Israel with whom we discuss what seems to me to be the fundamental practical issue, and sorry if I'm not being academic enough, but the fundamental practical issue in this, which is how can Israel restore its moral authority in a way that people can never think, those who are anti-Semitic as a sort of gut instinct, that they have any justification for their anti-Semitism because of the way that Israel behaves. Again, sorry, these sounds like frightful name drops, but my excuse for not having been an academic is that I did meet quite a lot of people who did stuff in the world, and one of them is F.W. de Klerk. And I went with him to Haifa University a few months ago, where he received an honorary degree in front of a very liberally minded and, I thought, extremely interested audience at that university. And he spoke about the difficulty of changing long-running opinions that you hold, and about his life's journey. And he made it clear that he wasn't making any trite comparisons with the situation in Israel and Gaza and the occupied territories. He did make the point that, of course, in order to make the sort of change that he made, you needed a companion on that journey. And the companion on that journey, of course, Nelson Mandela, was an exceptional man. There is no Palestinian Nelson Mandela. It would be ever so helpful to the cause of anti-Semitism if some resolution could be made of the problem with Gaza and the occupied territories. But that seems to be a very long way away. You know, I was 10 yards away from an IRA mortar bomb. 2 of them went off in the garden of number 10. I was speaking at the time, actually. It was a rather extreme attempt to stop me speaking. And so when we started cozying up to the IRA, it wasn't an easy situation to find oneself in. But I now feel a lot better for the fact that we did. I think the problems in Gaza are reinforced by the fact that the Gazans suffer, and I've just got 2 points to make, okay? The first of those points is that the Gazan situation has become enormously more complicated because Gaza is now not only the victim of Israel, it is the victim of its own rulers. And the cynicism of those who run Gaza, one of them from a safe place in Doha, almost inviting the kind of destruction in Gaza that happened as part of their own political cause. I think Hamas is an appallingly bad thing for the people of Gaza. But the second thing I would say, when I go to Israel, I see wonderful work being done, fundamental areas of medical research and so on. And those fundamental areas of medical research need to be promoted to the world. Israel needs to be presented as a force for good in the world. What stands in the way of Israel being accepted in many parts of the world as a force for good is these impossible to excuse, really, scenes of bombing of domestic populations. And that is so difficult not to give rise to a whole host of bad, adverse reactions. And so I feel the same about anti-Semitism as I felt about the situation in Ireland. Something has got to be done to deal with any practical base on which anti-Semitism can appear to have any rationality. Anti-Semitism is a fundamentally irrational thought process, and those who want to end anti-Semitism should end anything that allows people to think it's a legitimate point of view.
Thank you very much, David. Despite your comments, actually, this is not an academic conference, and many of us are not academics, but there's lots of things you've said there that I both agree and disagree with, and I'm sure it'll allow us to really deepen the conversation when we go out to the audience. So, Hugo, to finish off, what your thoughts, please?
Sure. Hello. Thanks for having me here. It's really good to be here. Pretty much all Jews in Britain, my family has a story about how we came here. In fact, we have 2 stories. We have my mother's family story. They were refugees from the war, and I'll maybe talk about them in a minute. We also have my father's family story, which we've been, on my father's side, Rifkins have been in Britain a lot longer. They came in the late 1890s as economic migrants from Lithuania. And the first to come was my great-grandfather, a man called Charles Rifkind. And we have a great family story about him, which kind of illustrates pretty much the worst anti-Semitism my family has ever faced in Britain. And this involves him. He was a door-to-door salesman in Fife, north of Edinburgh. And he was a gentle, bookish, sort of Yiddish-speaking man. And he'd travel around the villages of Fife and he'd, sell things door to door. And he had this story about coming out of a door one day, and a man ran up to him and punched him in the face, full on in the face, we think breaking his nose. And he held his nose together and he said, and I'll try the Yiddish accent, forgive me if I don't say it very well. He said, for why are you hitting me in the face? And the man goes to him, I hit you because you're a Jew and the Jews killed Christ. To which my great-grandfather goes, well, even if this is true, this was many thousands of years ago. And the guy goes, aye, but I only heard about it yesterday. Now, I like that story, and I tell that story for 2 reasons. That, for my family, we've been in Britain for over 100 years now. That's as bad as it gets, and that was a long time ago. So when we talk about a rise of anti-Semitism in Britain, and I think we should, I think it's important to talk about it and important to notice it, it's also important that we recognise that we're rising from a very low base. Britain has historically been one of the best countries to be a Jew, certainly for the last 100 years. I think the rise of anti-Semitism in other parts of Europe at the moment, not just in Eastern Europe, France particularly terrifying right now, is actually a far more severe problem. That's not quite what I'm going to go on to talk about now, but I think that's something to be more worried about. In Britain, I think we're doing all right. There are worrying things happening, however. I wanted to talk a bit about those worrying things and what they are. I think it's a mistake to regard anti-Semites as a breed who attach themselves to concerns, as people often do when they talk about anti-Semitism in Israel, that anti-Semites use Israel as an opportunity. Anti-Semites aren't a type of person, and anti-Semitism isn't a state of being. Anti-Semitism is a descriptive term that you can apply to other things. It does get conflated a lot in our society with anti-Zionism, sometimes deliberately, sometimes in a more confused way. I think a lot of people end up being anti-Zionist or even pro-Zionist without quite knowing what Zionism is, which is confusing for many people. And we can talk about that later as well. I mean, sometimes when people target Zionism, they do so explicitly in order to target Jews. That's certainly true. I remember while, I think just after the conflict in Gaza had slowed down, Yvonne Ridley, the journalist and nutcase from Scotland, talked about wanting to make Scotland a Zionist-free zone, which is a very chilling thing to say. She wasn't saying a Zionism-free zone, she was saying a Zionist-free zone. And if you're not aware of the implicit anti-Semitism in a statement like that, you should be, frankly. The main way I think that anti-Zionism, which anti-Zionism itself need not be inherently anti-Semitic. It's quite hard to navigate anti-Zionism and avoid anti-Semitism because of what it means. But it need not be inherently anti-Semitic. The way it tips over into becoming anti-Semitic is all to do with how we treat Jews in Britain. Is all to do with how you treat the Jews who are not Israelis, I think. Because if you regard Jews who are not in Israel as in some way indivisible from Israel, in some way responsible for Israel, not just like supporters of Israel, but responsible for legitimate targets for the ire you feel against Israel, then that is anti-Semitism. And the reason why that's anti-Semitism is because that's taking people in this country, British people in this country, and saying to them, you're something else. You're not one of us, you don't belong here, you belong somewhere else. Weirder than that even, you're saying you belong somewhere else, and the people who are there don't belong there. So that gets incredibly confused. But I mean, that's how it happens. I think people, it's vital to be very careful when discussing anti-Zionism with Jews. First and foremost, that you assume it's their problem, because Jews are not Israelis, and Jews should not have to constantly explain that they're not Israelis. Another way I think anti-Zionism tips over into anti-Semitism is just in its sheer, how to put this, in its sheer prominence in our discourse. It's an argument often made by Israelis, by Zionists, what about all the other bad countries in the world? And it can be used, it's an argument that can be used disingenuously, but it has to be argued. It has to be answered, that argument. What about all the other bad countries in the world? Why this one? And my answer to that, having given it a lot of thought, I find my answer in a theory of robotics, perhaps strangely. There's a theory of robotics called the uncanny valley theory. And this is a theory that argues that basically if you have a robot that looks nothing like a human, it's just a robot. And if you have a robot that looks exactly like a human, then we're delighted by it and it fools us and we engage with it as if it was a human. But if you have a robot that looks almost but not exactly like a human and we can just tell it's not, then we're revolted. And that's the uncanny valley theory. And I think people look at Israel and they see a country that is almost European, but in crucial ways not. And it stirs passions that people say that's just not right, that's not how it ought to be. And the reason why that's particularly worrying is because historically, of course, that's also how people have looked at Jews, as people who are in societies but not quite of them, not quite right. And you still, when you have Jews in public life a lot, they'll often be in the manner in which they're criticised, a sense that they're not quite right, that there's something of the night about them, for example. And it's things like that are quite pervasive. I fear a bit that things like that are growing and have grown somewhat lately. I thought, coming out of Gaza, coming out of that conflict, there was a very worrying environment. I wrote about it at the time. There were very worrying currents in the environment, and they weren't all explicit and nasty. There was that case near here of it was at Tesco's or Sainsbury's where they removed all the kosher foods because they were afraid that they would cause problems. That sort of thing is very chilling and frightening as a Jew. Not so much that anyone was going to cause problems, but just that the idea that they were afraid that they might cause problems, that the mere nature of being of Jewishness was considered to be this sort of incendiary thing that you really had to worry about. As to whether Jews have historically in Britain cried anti-Semitism in order to defend Israel in places where it was not warranted, I think that's probably sometimes true. I've certainly had arguments with Jews in which they have tried to portray Britain as a more anti-Semitic country than I have ever felt it is. But I think it's important to understand where that comes from and to understand that that's not cynical, that's not made up. I talked about how my family has, two stories of getting here. My mother's family story, they came, yes, as refugees during the war. This stuff is fresh. This stuff is recent. People forget. I've been to Yad Vashem in Israel. I've tracked down the uncles I don't have. Well, once removed uncles. People who'd been first cousins of my mother. My grandfather on my mother's side had a wife and child who didn't make it to Britain. Whole family's gone. This stuff is very recent. And if you're like me, I was born in the late 70s. You don't normally think of it as being recent. You think of it as being this sort of slightly other planetary thing that happens. Even if it's your family, it happened to. And you think of it as being this other planetary thing because you think, because nothing like that could ever happen here, because there's no way that I could ever be othered here, because I belong here. Particularly I have a family who've been embedded in public life for many decades now. And, you feel I could not be othered. And then you feel yourself being othered. And there is a strong temptation to overreact because it's kind of terrifying. And that is why I think even though we have anti-Semitism at a low level in this country, any nudge up, any increase is something to be deeply concerned about. Thank you.
I usually try and bring the panel all in, but I'm going to go out and take a couple of points and then bring a couple of you in, if you see what I mean, and then do it that way, just to get a sort of sense of what the concerns or issues in the audience are. So can I just see if there's anyone who wants to immediately speak, and then we can kind of kick off the discussion. So there's this gentleman here.
Do you think there's been a similar rise in Islamophobia due to the rise in the strength of ISIS and increased exposure of ISIS in Western media?
The question about agency, really. I've been following the issue of Israel and Palestine since the 70s when I was introduced to it by anti-Zionist Jews, Moshe Makova by name. And I've followed events, and I've been to Israel, I've been travelled around a little bit in 99 between the intifadas, meeting refuseniks who refused, soldiers in the IDF who refused to serve in the occupied territories. Now, for me, there's an interesting dynamic at the moment which is seldom being referred to in the numbers of leaders of the Jewish diaspora in the world who are becoming increasingly critical of Israel's internal policies and attitudes to Palestinians. Mika Paled, Henry Siegman in America, but many, many prominent people, and increasingly groups of people, what I consider the very brave breaking the silence veterans from the IDF, hundreds of them who are telling the stories of what they're being asked to do in the occupied territories, the demonstrations. I know it can be debated about the numbers and the social weight of these groupings, but I actually see the basis for a much more constructive discussion about the future of the region. And my fear in the discussions here is that we must avoid a conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism to begin to talk about a possible peaceful secular future.
Thank you, very useful.
I was very disappointed this week to learn of the National Union of Students' decision to vote against a motion which was a declaration of solidarity with the Kurdish resistance to Islamic State on the grounds that it might be interpreted as Islamophobic. The following motion, which was approved by the National Union of Students, was a declaration of solidarity with the people of Palestine. And really it relates to the point at the front, but I just wondered how the panel would perceive the fallout between the left and Zionism since the 60s, and whether the fact that the left has been so silent over Islamic State but so vocal over the events in Gaza does relate to this unconscious anti-Semitism.
Maybe it's a related point. It's a sort of tortured relationship on the British left towards Israel. So all the way up to as late as 1968, reading in the New Left Review, there was this image of the kibbutzim building a promised land, workers with their shirts off, shovels in the sun, right up to that point. And then in the 70s it really shifts, right? And you get this real hostility and maybe a sense of betrayal in the British left that it's not worked out as the promised land of free workers that they'd hoped for. And then there's this incredible resentment that builds up to the situation we have today, where we have the Labour Party pushing a motion to recognise Gaza as a nation, while on the back flip, almost asserting that Israel does not have the right to exist as a nation. And lots and lots of people in the West seem to be quite happy to say that a two-state solution must be enforced on an Israel which by now, has been there quite a long time, seems to me to have fought for and won the right to exist as a nation. And if there's to be any way forward, doesn't the left need to recognise that fact now?
Has there been an increase in Islamophobia due to ISIL? I'd rather defer to a Muslim to answer that question because, I think a Muslim person would probably have more sensitivity to Islamophobia. But I think that what that raises is the way in which Jews and Israel are conflated in a way that Muslims and what's going on in Muslim countries aren't. So while we saw quite a few attacks on Jews and Jewish businesses and synagogues in Europe during the Gaza war this summer, I'm not aware of attacks on individual Muslims when there are issues with the behaviour of Muslim countries or Muslim individuals like ISIL, those Islamic extremists. There is a conflation with Jews and Israel, which is very worrying, and I think people assume that all Jews support Israel all the time and so on. The second question was that there are people leaders in the Jewish diaspora becoming increasingly critical of Israel's policy, IDF soldiers breaking the silence. That's nothing new. I mean, it's fine to criticise Israel. There's lots of Israelis who are very critical of Israeli government policy. There are lots of Jews who are very critical of Israeli government policy, and I think that's a good thing. Israel's a democracy. There's a movement called Peace Now. That there's the human rights organisation B'Tselem, which advocates on behalf of Palestinians who are complaining of human rights abuses, and so I'm not quite sure what you're suggesting there.
On Islamophobia, I think the tolerance of British people is well established by what has happened. I was worried that when you've got homegrown British Muslims committing terrorist offences, that would lead to Islamophobia, but it hasn't. And actually, good comes out of bad. And what has happened to that poor taxi driver, who people are commemorating today, has meant that a whole lot of Muslims, including a lot of imams, have got together to also denounce ISIL. And I think that's a positive step. Good can come out of bad. I think when the gentleman who asked about, previous beliefs about Israel, I think we all in the 50s and 60s believed that Israel was the country that made the desert grow and all of that. And there was a moral imperative behind Israel, which I think became damaged by, first of all, the rise of right-wing parties in Israel, displacing the Israeli Labour Party, and also the arrival of other people in Israel who had very little time for what I would call liberal, tolerant values. And I do believe that we have got to passionately believe, and that's why I enjoyed what the gentleman over there was saying, that there is an answer to this, because there isn't an answer to this, it becomes a festering wound. If you wanted me to say, and that would be my final word, Comrade Chair, if you wanted me to say one positive thing, I spent quite a lot of time when I've been in Israel with a friend of mine who is a major benefactor of the Israeli Arab community, and we go around a lot of his projects in the Arab villages in the north of Israel. And he said to me a point that was absolutely true. He said, no one in those communities raises a hand against the state of Israel, whereas I'm afraid a lot of people that have been brought up here in this country have turned against us from the Islamic community. I see that as a good thing because it shows there's no reason why Jews and Arabs shouldn't live together if certain tensions can be removed. But the primary tension has to be removed is recognizing that the borders of Israel would work better if they were the 1948 ones. But all this stuff about Judea and Samaria makes it very difficult for the occupied territories ever to be willingly given up.
I'm not as practical as David is. It's just very sad that we cannot talk about anti-Semitism without talking about Israel. And that seems to be the nub of the problem, that we reached a point where the intensification or not of anti-Semitism is causally linked somehow to what goes on in Israel. And I think that's it's a bit of a stretch to argue that. If you look at the growth of anti-Semitism in many parts of Europe, East Europe, sort of Holland, Belgium, I don't think you can work out a causal connection between what happened in Gaza or the policy of the government in Israel. Otherwise, basically what one is saying is that anti-Semitism becomes this entirely comprehensible and understandable phenomenon because of the behavior of a particular kind of government. That's not something that we would argue about racism, that's not something we would argue about sexism or anything else. But in this particular instance, we always go back and roll the film backwards. And it's something that a government may or may not have done. And I think that's really the nub of the problem, because by that logic, anti-Semitism becomes almost legitimized, because what do you expect when these IDF soldiers are killing children and doing barbaric things in Gaza? What do you expect people to react? How do you expect them to behave? And I think that is a huge problem, because it basically indicates that in many respects, what we have now is a very different kind of anti-Semitism, one that is as much to do with the guilt and the anti-modernist attitudes of the Western cultural elites who, perhaps in the past were fairly uncritical in their relation to Israel, where in the 1950s, 1960s, Israel could do nothing bad because it's very convenient for them, whereas now, for a variety of reasons, those things have utterly changed. One of the interesting things is, just one point about Islamophobia, is that in many parts of Europe, you can have hatred towards Muslims running in parallel with hatred towards Jews. The two are, and that's where you see that it's not a Gaza issue, it's to do with a particular attitude towards other kinds of people, particularly Jews and Arabs. And I think that demonstrates to us that what we're seeing is not a phenomenon that was born in Israel, but it's something that's to do with the way that European societies organize themselves.
I think that's a fair enough point, although I remember 25, 30 years ago, I happen to work in Brick Lane now, but I went there because there were many attacks on Bengali families and anti-Muslim sentiments and the far right organising very viciously, whereas today we see Britain is different. But there is a distinction, I think, by what people say about this anti-Muslim Islamophobism, which I think actually today people are very politically and culturally correct. And the hysteria we've seen around the discussion around Zionism and its relationship to Jews. It does strike me in an age where everyone talks about people as victims and being, we have to respect their integrity and everything about them. But when it comes to the discussion about Zionism, it's a very different moment that happens. Would like to ask David why it's the responsibility as it happens for anyone to tell Israel to be have more moral authority than anyone else. I mean, what strikes me as particularly unreasonable is how everybody wants to point out how somehow Israel is less morally responsible than everyone. Of course, we could all say things like, during the Arab Spring, it might be a bright idea if the Israeli elite and the Israeli people said, we support ordinary people in the Middle East and we can sort out our problems ourselves. But actually, it's called national self-determination. I think that whilst we may not have pogroms here, the recent hysteria where people start saying that everything from ISIS being a conception of Mossad and the CIA to the notion that increasingly we have conspiracies is a really particularly problematic dynamic that we have to challenge.
Israel is a little bit strange as being, in terms of it, as a product of Western intervention in the Middle East. And it does play quite a strange role there. But in the same way that a criticism of Israel shouldn't be conflated with the targeting of Jews or even of Israelis, that you can criticize Israel for its actions and the role it plays in relation to its imperialist actions and its role, particularly during the Cold War, but even since then, you can see that the fact that they don't play the same role for the West that they once did, and the automatic support for everything that Israel does is no longer the response that Western governments give, and there is open criticism now. However, Israel is still funded by America, and to a lesser extent Britain, in a way that when people compare money being given to the Palestinians, that's of an entirely different kind. It's not for military hardware and for weapons to reinforce their domination of other peoples. And so Israel does play a different role in the Middle East to other nations, and to criticize them is not anti-Semitic or in any way targeting ordinary Israelis. It's a criticism of the Israeli state and its Western sponsors.
What do you see in the near and distant future of anti-Semitism? Do you think it will rise or fall, and why?
Directly answering that, I was immensely heartened by what happened after Gaza. I wrote a couple of pieces noting the really uncomfortable atmosphere there was around that, and the response I got from that was astonishing. The fact that the debates like this are happening now, I think, and maybe I kid myself, but I feel that there was a sense of a section of the left at that point slightly glancing into the abyss and thinking, oh my God, actually, which way is this going? And so I think in Britain, anyway, that's very positive. I was interested in what the gentleman up there said, talking about the extent to which, you know, Mossad, the idea that Mossad sort of put together ISIS and all that. You know, the place of Jews in conspiracy theories is ceaselessly fascinating to me. I've often thought that if there is a Jewish conspiracy, I don't know why they haven't asked me to join yet. I don't know what more I can bloody do. But I think it's something. I think some part of the presence of Jews at the heart of conspiracy theories is to do with the fact that Jews in the countries to which they are immigrants, which, you know, however far you go back, is pretty much everywhere you will find them, they do not assimilate in a quite normal fashion for immigrants. They do for the first generation or the second generation, but then Jews are often very keen to embed themselves in societies, and many seek to become business establishment, political establishment, sorts of establishment, I guess as a sort of security blanket type way. They're very keen to involve themselves. We are very keen to involve ourselves in the structures of the societies in which we live. And I guess that sort of thing can encourage the idea of there being, you know, sort of secret brotherhoods spread around society or that sort of thing in a sort of Masonic type way.
You started off the meeting talking about your experience in Liverpool and what happened at Marks and Spencer's, and Hugo spoke about Sainsbury's, not that there was a danger, he said, but having to take the goods off the shelves. Well, perhaps there's something that people here aren't aware of, and this is a huge concerted organization that works towards delegitimizing any company in this country that has any trade with Israel. So you find, for instance, outside Marks and Spencer's in Marks and Spencer's in Marble Arch, for the last 12 years, there have been a group of people working against Marks and Spencer's with diatribes against Israel, with delegitimizing the state of Israel, and calling for a Palestinian state from the river to the sea, which means no Israel. And this we need to understand is at the bed of anti-Semitism in this country that I, as an immigrant, have felt increasingly in the recent years. I feel, in a sense, that I'm being retrenched into a backdrop of being a Jew and not a citizen of this country.
Well, I think there's anti-Semitism and there's anti-Semitism. I think we have to be look at. Well, I feel like there's the good old-fashioned anti-Semitism from Eastern Europe, which is it's like the anti-Semitism there used to be across Europe until World War II, because they never went through the guilt trip after World War II in Eastern Europe. So I meet Eastern Europeans, we get chatting, and I say, oh, I've got family from Poland. They had to leave in a bit of a hurry, ha, ha, ha. And their faces blanch in a good old-fashioned anti-Semitic way. Whereas, you know, then there's French anti-Semitism, where, you know, recently they had the anti-Gaza, the Gaza demonstrations in the summer, and I asked my father, who was over there, what it was like, and he said it was no more than usual. Whereas here it is different. And I've never seen before in my entire life anti-Semitism so publicly displayed in The Guardian and across, amongst liberals. And I'm wondering, is one of the causes just a lack of historical perspective? Because people, like you were saying, the Holocaust seems like a million miles away. People have lost a sense of historical perspective and just mix up Israel and Zionism because they're ignorant.
I mean, my point follows on in a way from your point, and I wanted to raise the role of the media. As someone who marched on one of the Gaza demonstrations in the summer, I was very close to the Chelsea supporters against Israel's actions in Gaza at the time, but I was marching with Jewish friends, and I was really impressed with the number of obviously Jewish people because they were marching with Jewish banners, under Jewish banners, and also Hasidic Jews were there, and so on. None of that was clear from the images that were then presented in the press. So I think the media really has a role to play in this.
Jews are an almost, I think, possibly a unique minority in this country and indeed in the world, in that they're a minority that is not considered to be an underdog. You know, they're a minority that is considered to be a powerful minority, and that's pretty. I mean, there are equivalent groups sort of dotted around bits of India and stuff, but it's pretty rare in a sort of in a European context, and that can lead to language that would normally be directed at minorities being directed at them, particularly in France.
One of the things that's perhaps missing from this debate is the behaviour of the settlements, and that really is a key issue. And I think that the way in which the Israeli government have encroached on those lands, and we've seen the evidence of people. They're not my settlements. We've seen the evidence of people having. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
of having their olive trees ripped out, of having their homes taken away, and this is internationally illegal. We know it's illegal, and there are people who are boycotting. They're not boycotting Israeli goods. They're boycotting Israeli goods produced in the settlements.
Okay, thank you. No, don't stop. She's allowed to say that, just like anyone else is allowed to say anything else, right? Otherwise, what's the point?
David Miller came close to admitting that the Gulf states are paying much of the anti-Israel activities, but he was not ready to actually admit it in full. I mean, he was saying that it was almost that they've been paying, but in fact they were paying lots of the activities against Israel.
I'm saying that the head of Hamas is a billionaire, Quayed Howe, who sits in Doha, and while his people suffer, and I think that's an appalling state of affairs.
This debate is slightly narrower than it ought to be. Surely the roots of anti-Semitism are rooted in theology. And do you not think it might be a good idea that the leaders of those faiths might come out and renounce their blame, which has been heaped on the Jews, making them the whipping boy for 2,000 years?
I mean, I would contend that Britain is not free of anti-Semitism. In the most recent example, the thing that struck me most was Jon Snow's reporting from Gaza. It seemed to me to be completely hysterical. And just like him, the politicians in Britain, you know, what I would call basically carpetbaggers, who decided to, a bit like F.W. de Klerk, whose kind of newfound discovery of his love for black people is so amazing. So like David Cameron, whose newfound love for gays and gay marriage was so amazing. You know, they carpetbagging, looking for positions in order to establish their moral authority. And similarly with Gaza, you know, they can establish their moral authority by taking a stand, you know, against Israel, without reflecting on the fact that Western bombs in Pakistan or drone bombs across the East, the Middle East, you know, have killed thousands of people. That's somehow different than what Israel is doing. Oh, we're killing for humanitarian reasons while Israel is killing for barbaric reasons. That's not to condone what Israel does, but you know there is a kind of dualism there that reflects the fact that Western politicians are heavily involved in linking, Jews with barbarism in the Middle East in a way that sort of builds anti-Semitism.
The whole point I wanted to make is that there are Israelis and there are Jews, and if you're conflating them, you have to ask yourself why. The lady who talked about the crimes that are settlements. I agree. I've written that as an opinion columnist. I've written that as a leader writer. Settlements are a disastrous aspect of Israeli policy. They really ought to do something about. But you know, what the hell's that got to do with me or my granny?
Well, my basic thesis, which I shan't weary you with repeating, is that anti-Semitism will always exist because there are dreadful people around who are governed by their prejudices. I feel sorry for people who are governed by their prejudices. It's like the Oscar Hammerstein lyric, isn't it? You have to be carefully taught. You have to be carefully taught prejudice. And some people can never get rid of prejudice. But I do think that it would help if some of the provocations to prejudice were removed. And speaking as someone, as I say, played a part, a very minor one, in peace in Northern Ireland, having felt virulent, you know, when you're told you're on an IRA death list, it concentrates the mind a bit. You don't end up liking them very much. And so to have to sit down with them and, you know, see one of the main ones being greeted by the Queen, and you think, hang on a minute, it's a stupid thing. It's good what's happened. And, you know, that attack, which I did think was, frankly, disgraceful, on F.W. de Klerk. I mean, I appreciate it probably comes from someone who's never had to bear any high office in any of these things. But you see, the great thing about F.W. de Klerk is that he recognized he was wrong. The most difficult thing in life is to recognize you were wrong. It's what Disraeli once said, you know, about a fellow politician. He said, throughout his life, he only had one idea, and that was wrong. Well, F.W. de Klerk realized that he was wrong. He turned and, thank goodness, found Mandela. And in his speech at Haifa, what he was really saying is, everyone's got to try to investigate their thought process, and if it's wrong, change. And if I had any profound wish for the Middle East, and I'm back in Israel next month, it would be that the kind of things I see within Israel, with the Arab communities there, can be transferred into the territories with fairness and justice. But unfortunately, there's a lot of things that stand in the way of that. But anti-Semitism would take quite a nosedive if that happened.
My argument is that if Israel disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, that anti-Semitism wouldn't disappear, right? And I think that the two have got quite independent causes to them. And yet we have this compulsion to continually connect the two all the time, in a way that we don't do with, you know, other situations. And I think the question that we need to ask, why is it that in the 21st century, very intelligent people of all kinds of backgrounds find it very difficult to disentangle two issues that have got very separate causations to it? Why is it that the two have to go hand in hand? Why do we have a situation where I get a phone call at the university when I invite an Israeli academic, and I'm told that unless I kind of tell that academic not to come and force her not to come to England, everybody will boycott the workshop that I'm running in a way that I wouldn't get. And I never had, whenever I asked very controversial people to give speeches on a campus where academic freedom ought to exist. Why is it that exists? And it seems to me that there is a real reluctance to actually confront anti-Semitism as it is. And as some people were suggesting, anti-Semitism is not principally a problem for the Jews, right? I mean, the reason why I'm concerned about anti-Semitism has got nothing to do with the targets of anti-Semitism. It's a statement about our society as a whole. And I think it's something that, you know, we need to take on board as a very, very big issue for us. I do fear that, you know, until we get a grip on this particular kind of question, then its corrosive effects will become far, far greater. And I suppose my final thought is very simple, which is that, to me, the real problem are not the hardened, backward anti-Semites, the one that, you know, kind of have swastika tattoos and, you know, really, sort of make hissing noises at football matches. The real problem for me is the way that a large section of society has accommodated to that and looks at its shoelaces when it hears those things and kind of pretends to look the other way and not really recognize, engage with that. And that is the real problem. And that's why discussions like these, no matter what anybody's views are really so critical.
There was a professor of political science at Manchester who passed away recently, Professor Norman Jerris, and he referred to something called alibi anti-Semitism. And he said that's where people say that anti-Semitism is understandable because of Israel's behavior. And he meant understandable in the sense of excusable. And you know, relating to the point about settlements and so on, it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter what Israel does, obviously, but I mean, regardless of what's going on in Israel, regardless of the government policies or whatever, it's never excusable for a rise in anti-Semitism or attacks on Jews. And the second point is that most people understand anti-Semitism in terms of state-sponsored genocide. The Holocaust tends to condition popular understanding of anti-Semitism, and we all understand it as attacks on Jews and so on Jews as individuals. But it's important to remember that anti-Semitism can manifest itself at the level of discourse and at the level of thought processes and in relation to criticism of Israel. And it is difficult. There is a fine line between legitimate criticism and anti-Semitism, but we need to reflect on the way Israel is criticised and try and think about whether there are any tropes, any anti-Semitic tropes there, whether the criticism is rational, whether rational claims are being made about Israel, or whether those claims go against the evidence.
Thank you.